Welcome, everyone, to our talk about the future of Afghanistan. My name is Gregory Pfeiffer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. Now, it just so happens that last Friday was the 30th anniversary of the official end of the Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is hard for me to believe because just 10 years ago, I remember very well the 20th anniversary when I was in Moscow as the NPR correspondent there and just finishing work on a book about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the brutal conflict that set the stage for today's struggle over the country. Now, beyond the human stories of suffering, bravery, tragedy, and survival, what really struck me most, I would say, in writing the book was about how the Soviet war began. Now, when the USSR shocked the world by sending troops into Afghanistan in December 1979, few Western observers guessed that it was more the result of accident and blunder than a conscious decision to invade. The ailing Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and his cronies wanted to prop up a flailing fellow communist government in Afghanistan and prevent US influence from filling a geopolitical vacuum. To do that, they planned to foment a very quick coup with surgical precision. They failed to realize that sending in troops, which they saw as a mere precaution, would be seen inside Afghanistan as taking one side in a burgeoning civil war and be seen by the West as a land grab by a ruthless superpower. Now, the plot began when a cook who was a KGB agent working in one of Afghanistan's presidential palaces administered poison to the country's then president, Hafizullah Amin. Although he led the Soviet-backed Communist Party, he had angered the Kremlin by assassinating his predecessor, a rival fellow communist. The Soviets saw him as the main problem in Afghanistan. But when the cook dissolved the poison in Amin's favorite drink, a glass of Coca-Cola, the carbonated water counteracted the effects of the poison and gave Amin, at worst, a bad headache. A second poisoning 2 weeks later would have succeeded if doctors sent by the Soviet embassy in Kabul, which was uninformed of the KGB's plans, hadn't resuscitated Amin. By then, though, the Red Army troops that were sent to occupy Afghanistan were already invading, and the president was killed soon after when special forces stormed his palace. Now, when I was writing the book, to me it seemed that the bungling was comical, or would have been comical, had it not been for the results that were so tragic. The Kremlin's surprise incursion turned into a grinding campaign against local insurgents, made worse by dismal Soviet military discipline, vicious hazing, and miserable rations, which forced the Soviet soldiers to raid local farms and stores, which did more than anything to turn Afghan hearts and minds against Moscow. Fast forward to 2001, when US troops were far better equipped and trained and much better versed in the theory of insurgent warfare. But almost 2 decades after the US-led invasion, American forces are still mired in Afghanistan. Why? And what are the chances today for a political settlement that has eluded the country for 4 decades? If anyone can say, it's the absolutely stellar panel we have here to discuss the current situation in Afghanistan and peace talks and the planned US withdrawal. James Cunningham, second from your left, served as ambassador to Afghanistan from 2012 to 2014. His other senior diplomatic postings included ambassador to Israel and acting ambassador to the United Nations. After retiring from government service in 2014, he joined the Atlantic Council as a senior fellow. Just to my side here, Ali Ahmad Jalali served as Afghan's interior minister as well as ambassador to Germany. Previously, he had worked at the Voice of America for more than 20 years. He is currently a distinguished professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies of the National Defense University. His most recent publications include A Military History of Afghanistan, From the Great Game to the Global War on Terror. And Richard Olson, in the middle, served as the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan from 2015 to 2016. His many other diplomatic posts included U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan and Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. He retired from the Foreign Service in 2016 with the rank of Career Minister. Olson is the recipient of many awards, including a Presidential Distinguished Service Award and Afghanistan's Medal of Wazir Akbar Khan, awarded by President Ashraf Ghani. He is currently Senior Advisor at the Asia Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace and Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Project on Prosperity and Development. And finally, our moderator at the end, Hashim Wadatyar, is Program Director at the Institute of Current World Affairs, and he's also been a Fellow at the Asia Society since 2012. Hashim served as spokesman and senior program officer at the United Nations Regional Program for Afghanistan and neighboring countries for almost a decade. He's an Afghan analyst on foreign policy and counterterrorism, as well as a frequent commentator in print, radio, and television. So our panelists will talk for an hour, followed by a half hour of questions from the audience. And with that, I will hand off to Hashim with the one request that you all please take a moment and silence your cell phones. Thank you very much. Hashim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our today's event at this very important time that the United States is engaged with the Taliban on peace negotiations to bring its 17 years costly war to an end and bring its forces back home. At this moment, all of us, let's commemorate the sacrifices that the men and women in uniform from the United States, international community, and the Afghans in the first line, that the sacrifices they have given and have been given in a fight against terrorism. The United States talks with the Taliban on peace in Afghanistan is rapidly occurring, both by Washington and also by Moscow, the simultaneous approach. But the question here is that, is peace possible in Afghanistan? From the other end, Moscow a few weeks back organized the so-called inter-Afghan dialogue on peace in Afghanistan and brought together some politicians from Afghanistan and over 10 prominent political figures from Taliban's Qatar's office to Moscow to discuss the peace in Afghanistan. So Russia is involved. Some regional actors are involved, starting from Islamabad, Dubai, Doha, Riyadh, and of course Washington. So we will discuss in this talk that the role of the regional actors in peace talks in Afghanistan. Recently, the Afghan president is involved to have National Grand Assembly with participation of the representatives from all corners of Afghanistan to discuss the peace talks in Afghanistan. So these are the discussion that we'll be having today with our very well-distinguished speakers here on the panel. And let me thank you all for your services in Afghanistan. Let me start with Ambassador Cunningham. You were ambassador in Afghanistan not long ago. And the United States is involved on withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And the U.S. forces are dramatically decreased in Afghanistan compared to 2012, 2013. And the U.S. forces are also not directly fighting in the first line because the Afghan security forces have taken the responsibility. So the question is that, is the United States in, out, or in between in this fight against terrorism?
I think most Americans certainly don't realize that the Afghan security forces actually took the lead in combat operations well before the end of 2014. And during that period, the last year that I was in Afghanistan, when we held presidential elections and the transition took place on the military side, the focus on the part of the American forces of the United States and our international partners was on making the transition and drawing down presence. So the American military engagement in combat has been on decline for quite some time. Unfortunately, in my view, that engagement, that disengagement of the American military role in Afghanistan took place on a pace that was too rapid, too accelerated, which then required a rethinking on the part of President Obama towards the end of his administration, and a decision by him, the correct decision, I believe, not to withdraw American forces and to leave the question of what to do about Afghanistan up to his successor. Since then, there was a review of American policy by President Trump. He made, I think, the correct decision, even though it went against his own desires. He made the correct decision not only to remain in Afghanistan, but to send a small number of additional forces there. The importance of that was that there were capacities and capabilities that the Afghan security forces don't have, that are being built, but it takes time. And the importance of the president's decision was to send back American advisors, troops who could fill some of those holes and restore the capabilities that had been lost over the preceding year or so. So that's in a way, to go to your question, but it's also a posture that is capable of being maintained over time at relatively low levels. There's nothing magic about the numbers involved. You've seen reports in the press that there may be a further withdrawal, whether it's a couple thousand or 7,000, eventually doesn't really matter. What is absolutely crucial, though, is that the military capabilities that need to be performed are performed, whether by Afghans or by American military, or by the militaries of our many partners, which we always need to keep in mind, are many partners who are engaged with us on the ground in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador. So the U.S. Special Envoy for Reconciliation in Afghanistan is engaged with the Taliban on the U.S. withdrawal as well, after a number of guarantees and stuff. And the Taliban say that there will be no threats to the United States after the withdrawal. Do you think that the Taliban can keep the promises that afterwards there will be no threat from Afghanistan, from any other terrorist group from the country?
History makes me doubtful that that is the case. What we will see at the end of this process, I hope, is an agreement among Afghans, the Taliban, and the vast majority of Afghans who support the partnership with the United States and the international community on a framework that will make such a guarantee credible. It's not foreseen, and it's hard to foresee that the Taliban itself could affect such a guarantee. They can certainly help create such a guarantee under the right political settlement, and that, after all, is the goal, which Ambassador Khalilzad has made very clear. His goal is to get to a peace negotiation and a peace settlement which is enduring. And under that situation, with international partnership of whatever sort, I think that guarantee can be carried out.
Thank you, Ambassador. Minister Jalali, let's discuss the inter-Afghan dialogue. If we look to the past almost 4 decades in Afghanistan, the Afghan politicians have never sustained their political settlements or their political agreements on forming governments in Afghanistan. For instance, look at the Peshawar Agreement, where the Mujahideen government was formed, led by Sabqatullah Mujahidi in beginning of 1990s, in 1992. And in the first few months, the agreement was broken and the civil war started. These leaders also went to Makkah and took oath that they will not fight again, but by their return, they start fighting again. Now that the Moscow conference is going on after so-called inter-Afghan dialogue with the participation of the political figures and the Taliban, and some say that there should not be any presence of the foreign forces and let Afghans to have agreements by themselves on the peace. Do you think that the inter-Afghan dialogue will bring lasting peace to the country?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. I think it is part of a wider topics that is peace possible in Afghanistan under these circumstances. Well, there's a lot of optimism that peace can be established in Afghanistan. And also there's a general consensus in the region and beyond that Afghanistan, neither side in the conflict can win militarily. So bringing some kind of a political settlement is the real option. However, given the complexities of the situation in Afghanistan, this country has been nearly half a century at conflict and political upheaval. And the multiple stakeholders that are involved, so that the pathway to peace could be a long way. I think the Ambassador Khalilzad rightfully said that it's not going to be a linear kind of a path. Many things can change the path, can change the process, can become impediment to a process. So you have to look at it in a wider perspective. And let me point out 4 issues that actually can shape the pathway to peace in Afghanistan, including what is happening inside Afghanistan. First is, what means the withdrawal of US forces? What does it mean? There's a lot of uncertainty about it in the region. Taliban already thought that, thinks that they have won the war. And also their supporters in Pakistan, they thought Pakistan was, right all along. But inside Afghanistan, they think that only withdrawal cannot peace to Afghanistan. Is this withdrawal a condition for peace, or does it end the peace? Does withdrawal define the peace, or peace defines the withdrawal? These things are, I think, if you take a page from the Geneva Accords, which actually took place 29 years ago, this in April 1988. 4 documents were signed. One between non-interference between the Afghanistan government and Pakistan. The other one guarantees, international guarantees that it will, which was also signed by the Soviet Union and the United States. And the third was about the repatriation of refugees. The 4th was the withdrawal of the Soviet. Only that withdrawal took place. These other things didn't pass. So only withdrawal cannot bring peace, unless it is part of a wider package. It's an end, not a condition. Well, Ambassador Khalilzad said that he is not negotiating withdrawal of troops, but negotiating for peace. But withdrawal is part of this, connected to this, because after all, the Taliban are negotiating with the United States only because of the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan. So this is something that should be clarified. And particularly inside Afghanistan, there are very negative perceptions what is going to happen. The second one is, yes, inclusiveness. Any peace agreement, any peace settlement can happen when there is inclusiveness there. And inclusiveness enough inside Afghanistan, outside Afghanistan, in the region and beyond. Inside Afghanistan, I think so far, whether the Taliban have the independence to put together a team, Well, they claim that they have a team now, but recently we heard that Mullah Brother cannot go to join the peace delegation because of some differences they have. So what will happen with that? Inside Afghanistan, unfortunately, Afghanistan is politically so divided that they could not put together a team that can be accepted to everyone. The government put together a team which was solely, the government team, and the lack of trust caused the team to be very narrow and not to be accepted by other political parties. Not only inside Afghanistan, Russia does not believe that the government team can represent everybody. That's why they want other political groups to be in. It is I'm happy to see that the government has realized that, and they're trying to expand the government team. And maybe in the Loya Jirga that will take place next month, this will be finalized. I think only a team that can represent all political parties, political class of Afghanistan can be in a position to negotiate with Taliban. Otherwise, yes, it should be a government team, but a government team representing all parties. Unfortunately, Afghanistan and during the past 4 or 5 years under the National Unity Government, it became politically more divided than the past. 4 years ago, I wrote that the major challenge for the unity government is to have a balance between maintaining the unity and governing effectively. But you see that this did not happen. That's something that it affects the peace process. The third one is inclusiveness in the region. In the region, this inclusiveness is not actually in a position that one can expect that what the regional actors say will implement or will deliver. Now look at the Pakistan invited the Taliban to meet with the government of Pakistan and discuss issues which are related to the government of Afghanistan. Looking at the Taliban as a state rather than, and that created resentment in Afghanistan government. And later on, you see when Pakistani ambassador says that if the India take military action, the peace process that Pakistan said they were the facilitators of it will, it will undermine the peace process. These things actually create shows that that kind of the consensus is not there in the region. It sometimes reminds me of a Venn diagram that you have. The Venn diagrams, you can see, there are so many things. India has problem with India. Iran has with the United States. Russia has so many other things. Can they find something to overlap all these things, like a Venn diagram? And it is not happening. So until this happens, the peace process will have some problems. And finally is the day after. What is good? What kind of peace is coming to Afghanistan? Afghanistan in the past 18 years is undergo a major transition, both institutionally, socially, politically, and economically. You cannot come and just change the constitution the way that you want it and you think that peace will come. And institutions in Afghanistan are the outcome of 17, 18 years of a lot of investment and sacrifices. And you cannot, just like the Taliban says, or sometimes that they would, the army will be dissolved or the constitution will be totally changed. This is something that you have to think about it. What is the price of peace for Afghan government? What's the peace of price for the Taliban? What is the peace of price for other actors? This is something should be very carefully and judicially put together, because no peace can be established unless it is legitimate, it is inclusive, it is sustainable.
Minister Jalali, you touched upon the national team to be built with participation of the government, the political parties, that can represent the government, Afghanistan. But from the other end, the Taliban insist on full withdrawal of the international forces of Afghanistan from the beginning till today, and that on Monday there will be a second round of the US and Taliban talks in Doha. Do you think that without the presence of international forces in Afghanistan, the Taliban can bring a lasting peace? And the country will not fall to another civil war?
It depends. No peace can sustain unless it is monitored, verified, and policed. Unless this is then Taliban can promise anything today. They will say that they will not allow the militants to use Afghanistan territory against the United States or its allies. But where's the proof? Who can guarantee this? The example of the Geneva Accord I gave you, there was no guarantee. There was no. It was only withdrawal of the Soviet forces that everybody was the outsider were interested. Even when the accord was signed, the United States and Pakistan said that they do not recognize the Afghan government as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So there's so many things that you have to do. It should be monitored, verified, and guaranteed. Then you can, that's why at the beginning I said the withdrawal of forces is not an issue that will bring peace. Taliban will claim that. Taliban probably for years will said, okay, when the international forces leave Afghanistan, then they will have a better position to overthrow the Kabul government. Something that Mujahideen was telling this everybody in 1980s. But it depends. The Mujahideen could not overthrow the government for 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal. Only when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the assistance stopped, then the regime collapsed. This is something that you have to think about it. What is the survival? Usually in insurgencies, the longer the state survives, the lesser chance the insurgencies will have to overcome. So it is how to make sure that what the deal is made, that can be implemented.
Thank you, Minister. Ambassador Olson, you were the US ambassador to Pakistan, and then to UAE, and then US special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Actually, the other way around, but yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. So, taking your role as an ambassador to Pakistan, US special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then UAE. So, and you were also the US lead on initial peace negotiations with the Taliban. There are multiple actors involved, not on nation-wise, but regional-wise and beyond. And some of these actors they don't love each other. Like, look at Doha and Riyadh, look at Dubai and Doha, look at Russia, Moscow and Washington. How do you see the roles of these actors and the complexity of this region that they will bring peace to the country?
Thank you, Hashem. I'd like to, if I could first, I'd like to address the sort of the big question of whether peace is possible. And I agree broadly with Ambassador Jalali. But let me say that if we ask the question, is it possible? I would say, I would express cautious optimism that yes, it's possible. Is it probable? That's another question, and that's a little more difficult. But there are some basic reasons for cautious optimism about a peace process. First of all, as Ambassador Jalali indicated, it is militarily in Afghanistan, there is currently a declining stalemate. None of the parties to the conflict, the principal parties to the conflict, that is to say the Afghan government, the US government, the Taliban, believe that they can attain military victory. All of them are signaling that some kind of negotiation is necessary, even the Taliban. No one believes in an outright military victory. And particularly for the United States, this is a shift in policy over the past couple of years. It's implicit in the Trump administration's South Asia policy, but with the appointment of Ambassador Khalilzad, it has been a central focus of U.S. policy to pursue a political settlement in Afghanistan and to subordinate purely military considerations to the political objective. To me, that is something that is significant and is new under this administration. It's also significant that Ambassador Khalilzad has put the issue of troop withdrawals on the table for discussion, and that is what has led to the current series of back-channel negotiations that are taking place in various venues around the world. This is not to suggest, as Ambassador Cunningham correctly noted, that we have agreed to a withdrawal. There's been no formal announcement of a withdrawal. What it suggests is that Ambassador Khalilzad knows that that issue has to be addressed and has to be addressed with the Taliban in order for a peace process to move forward, since that is in fact the Taliban's principal desire. My own view on this is that any troop withdrawal will have to be conditions-based and will have to be phased in order to allow for the kind of verification of Taliban guarantees on security that are necessary. What the U.S. seeks from the Taliban is an assurance, but also a reality that the Taliban has broken with international terrorism and that Afghanistan will not be used as a base for attack against the United States or other countries. And obviously, this is not something that can be, I totally agree with both the other panelists, it cannot be done on the basis of trust. It has to be on the basis of verification and facts on the ground. So the principal impediment at this point to a negotiated settlement is that the Taliban refuses to negotiate directly with the Afghan government because it believes, apparently, that it is still the legitimate government of Afghanistan overthrown by U.S. military forces in 2001. And so its grievance, it feels, is with the U.S. and not with the Afghan government. This is not unprecedented. There have been other negotiations in history. One party refused to acknowledge the other at the outset of the negotiations. And I think there are a lot of creative minds in Washington right now trying to address the various ways that this question could be addressed. Part of it might, there are diplomatic modalities, might address it, proximity talks, the possibility of a broader intra-Afghan dialogue in which the government is part of a Afghan dialogue that includes the Taliban, potentially President Ghani's peace jirga, which is being scheduled for next month. So, the question, I think, is, and this is where maybe one divides the optimist from the pessimist. If one is an optimist, one hopes that at the end of the day, the Taliban will be prepared in the right circumstances to engage with the upholders of the post-2001 order in Afghanistan. And if one is a pessimist, one thinks that they are not prepared to make that concession. The optimistic read is that this is their biggest concession, and they're not going to do it until they actually have something in hand. This leads me to conclude that this is just my personal view, that what needs to happen right now is we need to have a all-encompassing Big Bang negotiation in which the Taliban gets a commitment to withdrawal, the Afghan government gets negotiations with the Taliban, and the United States gets the assurances in a verifiable way that that its security interests will be addressed. I think that needs to be all upfront, not the result of gradual, lengthy negotiations based on confidence-building measures. Okay, let's turn to the region, which was your question, Hashim. Look, I think that the region is important, but I think that sometimes it has been overstated, and particularly the role of Pakistan has been overstated in delivering peace. My own view is that Pakistan has an important role to play in facilitating peace. It certainly has had a very active role in interfering in Afghan politics, going way back, and has engaged in extensive hedging behavior. That said, I don't think it can actually deliver the Taliban. I think that the most that Pakistan can do is incentivize the Taliban to come to the table or disincentivize them. And I think they have moved from disincentivizing to incentivizing the Taliban over the course of the past 6 months. Ambassador Khalilzad has said that publicly. He said that in his remarks at USIP a couple of weeks ago. But let's take a step back and look at the region as a whole. I think in terms of all of the powers that are engaged in hedging behavior and have engaged in hedging behavior with regard to Afghanistan over the past 4 decades, we need to identify what each of them wants. I think that Russia and Iran have some degree of alignment right now because they want clearly a U.S. withdrawal. They would prefer a withdrawal of U.S. forces almost immediately. And I think they would prefer that because they suspect that the United States is playing great game politics and looking to have the United States to have an unsinkable aircraft carrier in Afghanistan from which it can base its forces for use in the region. I think Pakistan and China actually have a more nuanced view on this. They would like to see the withdrawal of U.S. forces eventually, but they don't want to see chaos in Afghanistan in the short term. I think India is actually quite supportive of the U.S. retaining the commitment in Afghanistan that it has maintained for the past 20 years and is the most supportive of some kind of continued U.S. presence. The Gulf countries are mentioned. I think the Gulf countries have, an ability to facilitate some of these negotiations. They have a certain moral authority. They have a certain financial ability to provide financial inducements. At the end of the day, I think that the Gulf is actually pretty absorbed in its own conflicts, both external, that is to say, the Gulf Arab states against Iran, and internal, the dynamics between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, all of which suggest to me that the role of the Gulf countries can be perhaps helpful, but is likely to mostly be passive and not terribly proactive.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned about Russia's role as well. While Washington is actively engaged with the Taliban, Russia has its own way looked to the Afghanistan issue from its own way and discussed the peace talks under inter-Afghan dialogue.
Yeah.
So the question is Russia honest broker on these talks?
Well, I don't know whether Moscow will be an honest broker. What I would say is that in terms of Moscow's interests, as I laid out before, they would prefer to see a fairly immediate U.S. withdrawal of forces. But the important thing to remember is that Moscow does not have a huge amount of leverage in the current circumstances. They do not have an ability to deliver to any of the Afghan parties what they want out of a negotiated settlement. I mean, Moscow cannot deliver the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Only the United States can do that. So at the end of the day, I think Moscow is playing a game to maximize its own particular advantage. Now, with regard to the recent talks in Moscow, this was actually a gathering of, in effect, opposition politicians from Afghanistan with the Taliban. I don't think that was such a terrible thing. I think it was useful to have some direct negotiations between the loyal opposition, people who uphold the post-2001 order in Afghanistan, and the Taliban. The most important thing that is missing right now in Afghanistan, Ambassador Jalali referred to this, is a lack of the stakeholders, the Afghan stakeholders, the post-2001 stakeholders, those who believe in the Bonn process, to engage directly with the Taliban and make clear that the things that they are upholding, women's rights, education, all of these points, are not foreign imports, but are in fact reflective of the desires of the Afghan people. Polling suggests they are. That's the dialogue that needs to take place right now. And some of that happened in Moscow. And I think that if a suitable format can be found, it should continue.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Cunningham, so while we're discussing the peace in Afghanistan, the other important component is the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan. If the US administration decide, after negotiation with the Taliban, that they will fully withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, what will be the consequences afterwards, both for Afghanistan and the United States?
Well, first, I'd like to say that while right now, this is a very early stage of a very, very complicated political process. So the stated demand for the Taliban is the withdrawal of US forces prior to any number of other things. That's not going to happen. I'm reasonably confident. They probably understand that's not going to happen. I think that there's good reason to think, talking to people that I've talked to who have been talking with the Taliban, that on the part of their leadership, or at least portions of their leadership, they have a pretty realistic understanding of a number of the dynamics that are at play here. One of those dynamics, and this is a key dilemma if you put yourself in the shoes of a Taliban negotiator for a second, one of their key dilemmas is that they want Afghanistan to be secure and stable. In order to do that, they realize, I'm told, that a large amount of international support and cooperation is going to be required in the future in order for the country to move ahead. And that creates a dilemma for them in their own internal thinking and in their own internal communications with their fighters and the people who are in the field. They understand that they will need to find an accommodation, not just with Afghans, but with the international community. That gives the international community a very large amount of leverage as time goes forward. I would not rule out, at the end of the day, because the Afghan government and people, the international community, and the Taliban have a joint objective in seeing that Afghanistan is not used as a base for international terrorism. The Taliban have no fondness for ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the other international terror groups. Indeed, quite a bit of animosity. So there's a shared objective there. The question at the end of the day will be, how do we achieve that shared objective? And we've talked several times about can a guarantee that Afghanistan won't be used as a terrorist space be upheld, be verified. It's not that it has to be verified, it's that it has to be practical. There has to be a meaningful degree of cooperation between the parties involved to make that a reality for the future of Afghanistan, and that will be one of the key questions in negotiation going forward. I would not exclude that there would be a small international presence of troops in Afghanistan working with the Afghans on counterterrorism and training the Afghan security forces, of which the Taliban will presumably be a beneficiary under a peace settlement, and that there would not be a small ongoing presence in a peaceful Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador. Minister Jalali, if we look to the experience that we had on peace deal, in September 2016, the National Unity Government signed a peace deal with Hizb Islami militant group, the militant group who had been fighting the Afghan government and international forces for more than 1 decade in Afghanistan. That peace deal did not bring down insurgency at all in the country, but it was a vice versa, and the insecurity increased in the country. Do you think that the peace deal, if that happens with the Taliban, will bring a real peace and sustainable peace to the country, and other terrorist group will not replace the Taliban, like ISIS and the 20 other terrorist groups that President of the United States and President Afghani has been mentioning to the media?
Well, you refer to Mr. Hekmatyar's peace offer or peace deal with the government. That's totally different from the Taliban. Even before he made that deal, nobody expected that this will change the battlefield, because he did not have that kind of a capacity to influence the battlefield at all. However, it was politically good because this set an example that the peace can be, made with the opposition, and they can benefit from the peace. Because Hekmatyar was running around, he came back to Kabul. He's living very well in Afghanistan now. His family is there, and his supporters are better off. This was something that had kind of a political impact, not military impact. With the Taliban, they're actually fighting, and they have, although the Afghan government and Afghan security forces are in control of political major population centers, cities and provinces, but Taliban have control in the rural areas, large rural areas. So they can, are a major player on the battlefield, but it was not. Whether the peace with Taliban, it depends what kind of peace you are making, and is that peace verifiable? Is that peace actually can be policed? That depends on so many other things. Therefore, that's why I referred to in my opening remarks that the fourth one is the day after. What kind of a peace you have, you are making that. You cannot come and destroy everything and you think you're at peace. If Taliban believes that they will come and they will accept other groups as partners, but they will dominate, it's not going to bring peace. In 2 years, they can, sideline or drive other groups to the sideline, and this is not peace. This is not peace. This is the concerns that I hear from Afghans inside Afghanistan, and that's why when they say that the major fear of Afghans is this, that this peace is an exit strategy for the United States. The United States wants to get out of this war and wants some kind of a peace that will sustain only for a short time, and then the situation will deteriorate. That's the concern of Afghans mostly.
So you mentioned that it depends on the type of the peace deal, that what kind of peace is going to happen with the Taliban. If any type of peace deal is happening with the Taliban, how we will deal with the 20 other terrorist group, particularly the ISIS in Afghanistan? They are having like deadly attacks on Afghanistan.
Well, let's see. Some of these other groups that you are talking about, they are, there by default. Because they're unstable area in Afghanistan, they use that unstable area. Those who are fighting there, they are not going to fight for Afghanistan. The Uzbeks are the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. They have this interest in Uzbekistan, not in Afghanistan. So therefore, if they're at peace, the peace brings some kinds. No government can bring security unless it controls its territory. With a peace, that makes the government in a position to control its territory. Then it brings them legitimacy, because the legitimacy in any system, including in Islamic tenets, it's based on two pillars. That's justice and security. No justice and security can be established unless you control the territory. So with the peace, the government will become in charge and control of its territory. Then these small groups could be spoilers, but not. On the other hand, maybe some groups in the Taliban will not accept the peace deal. Look at the IRA, Ireland Republican Army. After Good Friday, one group actually did not, and still they said they are real IRA. They are real IRA. This can happen, but then the security threat would not be as significant as you have now today.
Thank you, Minister. Ambassador Olson, let's talk more about Pakistan. You touched on Pakistan before. Pakistan released Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, the deputy leader of the Taliban. Well, he was arrested once and he was released multiple times, but nobody hear from him at our interviews. So, and given that Pakistan providing safe havens to the Taliban and support the Taliban, do you think that Pakistan is really changed toward Afghanistan, and that change is like sustainable?
Well, I think that Pakistan clearly has, great responsibility over time for having, in the first instance, supported the creation of the Taliban back in the 90s, and then for allowing safe haven on their territory. Those things are indisputable. If you talk to Pakistanis, what they will say, and I had many discussions about this, more than I can count, while I was ambassador there, they felt that they were not prepared. The Afghan Taliban were so entrenched in Pakistan that it was difficult for them to uproot the Taliban without actually going to war with the Afghan Taliban, which they were reluctant to do. Don't forget, Pakistan has actually been fighting the Pakistani Taliban for much of the last decade, and quite successfully. So I think there's a lot of culpability here. I don't know that Pakistan's actual fundamental approach has shifted, but for some time they have favored the idea of a political settlement in Afghanistan in which the Taliban is a participant in a new political dispensation for Afghanistan. So I think there is alignment, potential alignment between the US position, the government of Afghanistan's position, and the government of Pakistan's position. And I think that what you have seen over the course of the past 6 months is, and Ambassador Khalilzad has said this, that Pakistan has been making efforts to get the Taliban to come to the table. What's happening with Mullah Baradar, that's a mystery, and I can't really say, what I think is actually happening or not happening. That's one of those real, there's too much intrigue surrounding that, and it's just very difficult to come up with a clear assessment about what it means. But I do think that Pakistan is right now trying to get the Taliban to come to the table. I think it was a mistake for the government of Pakistan to have agreed to meet with the Taliban, to have the Taliban meet Imran Khan. That sent the signal optically that somehow they thought the Taliban was going to take over, and I think that is a mistake, and I think it's good that they have apparently recognized that mistake and canceled the meeting. So I think that the reality is that Pakistan and all of the countries in the region will continue to engage in hedging behaviors and potentially be spoilers unless they are included in the process of reaching a settlement in Afghanistan. And on balance, that seems to be what's happening with Pakistan right now.
Thank you. Before going to with the audience for the question and answers, I have one question for all of you, if you can answer in 2 minutes. Lots of things are going on in Afghanistan nowadays. The presidential elections are scheduled. The Loya Jirga will take place next month on peace. The US withdrawal, we don't know actually whether that will happen or not. From the region is actively engaged on peace talks. As you say, that it was supposed that the Taliban will meet the Pakistan Prime Minister and also the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in Islamabad, that in the last moment it was called off due to political reasons and other reasons. That's what the US Special Envoy said. In 2 minutes, if you can answer, each of you, how do you see Afghanistan post-2019? Any of you?
Post where?
Post-2019.
I mean, after the end of this year.
End of this year?
End of this year.
Well, let me say, first we have to get through 2019. And, we haven't talked about elections, but there is a whole discussion to be had about the relationship between elections and peace. And there are some tensions there because the Taliban are certainly signaling that if the elections go ahead as planned, which the U.S. is strongly supportive of, another government is installed for 5 more years, it means 5 more years of war. So, and I think that President Ghani has been wise to, think about a jirga as a way of consolidating public opinion and possibly create a broadly cross party perspective on negotiating peace.
Well, there are several things are happening this year. The peace process is going on, and probably it will continue throughout the year. The presidential elections is going to take place this summer. These are all good. I think the problem in the country that they are using the peace process, the political class in Afghanistan, using the peace process in the elections to very parochial ends, and they have to, look more nationally and use the peace process and also the election. Election always brings division among the countries. In the countries that we have strong institutions, the rift can be bridged after the elections. But in Afghanistan, unfortunately, you have very weak institutions. That's make the leaders, particularly Afghanistan, more responsible to speak in one voice for the peace, speak and also, do a kind of a campaign, a very legitimate campaign for the elections. And currently, I think the most issue of concern is the political division inside Afghanistan. And I hope this Loya Jirga that is going to be next month will, bring some agreements between different political groups. And also, the election commission is now dismissed. The new election commission, how this commission is going to be established, all these things should be done to further establishment or and strengthening the trust inside Afghanistan. If and eventually the peace will come from Afghanistan among Afghans. The key is in Kabul, not in Islamabad. The key is in Kabul, not in Washington. And they have to get their acts together. If they do their acts together, then other things will fall in place. If this division in Afghanistan continues, and the election brings more divisions, then you have a problem with the peace process as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Minister Jalali just said. The key is in Afghan society and the Afghan political class and in Kabul itself. This, unfortunately, is the discussion that I had at length with Afghanistan's political leaders in the run-up to the last election. But then the discussion was about creating a consensus in Afghanistan about the elections and the result of the elections and how Afghanistan would be governed in the future. That didn't turn out particularly well, but they all agreed as we were going through the discussions in the year and a half leading up to the elections. They agreed in principle, but couldn't actually, in practical sense, compose their political differences. Trying to build a consensus on peace in Afghanistan and what a future Afghanistan would look like and what a relationship with the Taliban could be is a different problem and a different issue. And I'm hopeful, as the minister is, that and Rick is, I think, that the Loya Jirga can help build that kind of consensus among all of the Afghan actors and bringing in the inclusive sense that Minister Jalali was talking about earlier. That's really essential. You keep going back to the central problem of the negotiation will be how to convince Afghans and the Taliban that there's a workable future ahead for them. That's been an issue for a long time, but it hasn't received the focus that it might have in the past, but now it is. and creating a real sense of purpose and consensus among Afghans, the non-Taliban Afghans, I think will be a key ingredient in that, because the Taliban will have to understand, I think many of them do, that Afghanistan is no longer the same country it was 20 years ago. A great many things have changed, that there is certainly room for change going forward, but there is a consensus on the part of most Afghans about the kind of country that they want. And it's not the Taliban vision for Afghanistan, and that's what will have to be reconciled.
Thank you. It is time for the audience to have questions, but before asking questions, please tell us your name, affiliation, and who do you want to have the answer from the panel, and if you can have one question so that we can have chance for other audience. So yeah, you please. On a fourth row, my colleague will bring the mic to you in a second. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Wonderful discussion. As a woman, I'm Afghan journalist. My name is Nazira Azim Karimi. I'm independent Afghan journalist. I'm from Afghanistan, and I grew up in Afghanistan. The only thing that Afghan people concerned, especially women, you don't mention anything about women's achievement in this time in case of the successful of this, what will be women's achievement if the Taliban gets successful?
Okay, who do you want to answer the question?
Everybody, because they're all full of experience. I know all of them.
All right, so we will have one of them to answer the question.
Good,
Any volunteer?
Please.
Thank
Please,
you.
Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, I completely agree with the question and the point that there has been enormous progress in Afghanistan for women over the course of the past 18 years. And I think Afghan women would naturally fear that this would be reversed if the Taliban were to come to power or participate in power sharing with the government. And I think that is a critical discussion that needs to be had. It's one of perhaps the single most important part of the intra-Afghan dialogue that I think we're all agreed on this panel has to happen, and which hasn't happened yet. I also think, and this I'm going to say is a little more controversial, I think it is a topic that has to be discussed amongst Afghans. I don't think it is particularly, the Taliban, if they hear this from the United States, they will see this as a Western imposition. It needs to be Afghan women in particular talking to the Taliban directly and laying out their vision of Afghan women and their rights in accordance with Islam, but with a different version perhaps of Islam and what the Taliban believes. I think that is a critical discussion that has to happen, and everything that could be done to facilitate it, whether it's a loya jirga or delegations of Afghan women going to meet the Taliban, I think should happen at every possible occasion.
Thank you. Yes, you please.
I'm going to interrupt if I may jump in and ask one question. First of all, thank you all for a just terrific presentation. The most upbeat assessment I've heard about Afghanistan from some of the most serious experts on the country. I would just like to ask, how does the opium trade play into future plans and peace negotiations, which has been so lucrative for the Taliban and so destructive to such large parts of the country? Thank you.
Minister of Interior.
Afghanistan does not have a long history of opium production. And before the South Revolution, as they call it, according to UNODC, the total amount that was produced in Afghanistan was less than 100 tons. And that was produced only in very remote areas, in the Shinwar areas, in Nangarhar, in Badakhshan sometimes, in mountainous area of upper Helmand areas. And after that, with the deterioration of the state institutions and the state control, in the war, in the insurgency, and also many years of drought, the production of opium became part of both economy of the population and the very devastated, war-devastated areas, and also as part of the war economy. So therefore, it is a byproduct of the instability in Afghanistan. You cannot, even if you try to eradicate poppy fields or arrest so many of the traffickers, unless you control the area, control the region, and provide alternative means for the people who live there, this will continue. And now, one of the dividends of peace will be to control the area and also put the economy on a solid base in that. And I was talking to people in the Farah areas, and I asked why you are doing this. One farmer told me that I paid $1,000 to buy water this year, and not to irrigate because there was water. They pay for water pumps there. And he said, with that kind of the water, I can irrigate only 1 hectare of my land. It gives me only $500 for wheat and $5,500 for wheat. He said, bring me water, then I will do that. Then in Badakhshan, I was talking to people, you have water. I gave them the example of Farah. They said, okay, the day you put in jail some of these people who are forcing us to do that, then we will stop it. And then I was on the board in Baramcha in Helmand. That was the Baloch there, and that was a marketplace for it. And they said, unless you take care of these corrupt officials, so it is security, it's economy, it is governance. You have to mainstream fighting production of opium into all these aspects of that will actually end the enormous production of opium. Other than that, in the past 18 years, only the United States spent $750 million.
A lot, yeah.
And yes, but you cannot sustain it. Some people say that Taliban in the last year they eliminated them. Yes, but you could not sustain it the next year. Had they stayed in power, they would not have been able to sustain it the next year.
Your narcotics is going to be a big issue.
Yeah.
One of the positive things I'd like to note, however, is that that's an issue that actually provides a common interest on the part of Afghanistan, the United States, and the international community, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan at a minimum, and probably China as well. Generating international cooperation to deal with the narcotics trade in and around Afghanistan has been a fraught attempt over the years, but the potential is there to do a lot more, particularly if a peace process does start to take hold and start to produce results. And I hope that progress could be made in that regard as well, but it's going to be a real issue. It doesn't necessarily have to derail the negotiations, however.
Thank you. Yeah, you please. Left side, yeah.
Doug Brooks.
We'll come later.
Doug Brooks, Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. And I think one of the big issues I'm concerned about is an entire generation of Afghans who essentially have come of age while NATO has been there, who are computer savvy, English-speaking Democrats and Democratic. What are they going to do? They're going to be, potentially overruled by the rest of the Afghan population in terms of, agreeing to a Taliban essentially controlled or at least heavily influenced government. Are they going to stay? Are they going to reject this and try and fight it there, or are we going to have millions of them essentially become refugees over time, coming here into other places in Europe and so on?
Who do you want to answer the
question? Could go to just about anybody, but let's say Ambassador Olson.
Okay, Ambassador Olson, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so here's the dilemma. The way I look at this is that the Taliban is relatively speaking right now, militarily strong. You know, as Ambassador Jalali said, they control large portions of the countryside. They're able to make successful, complex attacks in other parts of the country. They don't have, I think, a lot of political support. And the polling suggests this, okay? The polling suggests that the majority of Afghans are upholders of, the post-2001 order in Afghanistan. So the question I think that all of us are grappling with on the panel is how do you mobilize the political strength of the Afghan elite, if you will, or those who have benefited, including women, from the post-2001 dispensation? How do you mobilize that latent political strength so that in the negotiations it doesn't skew towards the Taliban? That is a big challenge, and this is an area where I'm afraid I do have to be, slightly less optimistic than in other areas, because one has not seen the kind of coherence on the side of the Afghan political elite, the opposition, civil society, all the people who need to come together under the lead of the government, perhaps, but to create a genuinely national response to negotiating with the Taliban. If that happens, then I think that comes out with a very different set of withdrawal order than if you just leave it to be determined by who has what military strength on the ground right now.
Thank you. Okay, you please.
My name is Nisar Hawaii. I was born in Afghanistan, and I came here to the United States in 2010. Since then, I'm here, and I'm working for an NGO called Global Peace 1 Week Mission. My question has I have a very brief commentary, and then I have a question. While we are talking about Afghanistan, it's a spy war, I would say spy war marathon battlefield. And we know who is the player: Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, America. Basically what we are talking about, and we heard from the minister, that the key, we see and we hear a lot about the keys. Sometimes it's in Islamabad, sometimes it's in America, and sometimes it's in Afghanistan. Where is the master key? And the second question, about Pakistan as a player. So basically, Pakistan didn't fight Taliban in the area. They actually fought Pashtuns in those areas. And they dismantle and destroy their houses and their businesses. And the whole area has been everybody's killed, including animals in their houses and businesses. So how about we focus why not focus the war on terror in Pakistan rather in Afghanistan? And my question is directly to Mr. Ambassador Richard Olson.
Thank you. We discussed the key, and the key we discussed it is in Afghanistan, but we didn't discuss the master key. So where is the master key?
Well, look, I understand the anger of Afghans towards Pakistan. I understand the anger of Americans towards Pakistan. Pakistan bears a certain historic responsibility. However, at the end of the day, and I say this as someone who has negotiated with the Taliban and has had extensive contacts with the Taliban are not fully controlled by Pakistan, okay? They can be influenced, but they can't be directed, and they can't be directed, I think, to do something that is fundamentally against their interests, okay? The Afghan Taliban will gladly accept Pakistani safe haven, various forms of assistance, including financial assistance, waving them through the border, whatever it is. But they tend to make their decisions based on their own interests, okay? So I think Pakistan is a key, but I don't see it as the master key. I think the master key is is multi-party. It involves, the regional dimension, but it also involves the U.S. talking to the Taliban, but most important, an intra-Afghan dialogue between the government, the loyal opposition, the upholders of the post-2001 order in Afghanistan, and the Taliban.
All right. Yep. Second floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Mujda Karimi from George Mason University, student studying government international relations and also intern at the State Department. I have a quick question. It's very basic. Since the U.S. Forces withdraw from Afghanistan and we see instabilities will continue in Afghanistan and how it will affect on the people of Afghanistan, especially in terms of immigration and economic. Thank you.
So how the withdrawal of the US forces will affect the people of Afghanistan, the immigration, and the economy?
It's
And who do you want to have this question for?
anyone. Thank you.
Well, I think the question is based on the premise that somehow the American military presence in Afghanistan is a requirement for the long-term future of the country. It's not the American military presence that will help secure Afghanistan's future, although it will be necessary for a while, for sure. What's really more necessary are two things: the actions of the Afghans themselves to continue building on the progress that's been made in the past years, and the support and cooperation of the international community, which is solidly there so far. This is another thing that many Americans don't appreciate, is how big a role our international partners are playing, not just in the security field, but overall in Afghanistan in terms of development assistance and education and progress and all those kinds of things that we want to see keep growing and building. The American withdrawal of military forces under the proper conditions is a natural thing. It would not be natural for the United States to maintain forces in Afghanistan just to be there. And that, unfortunately, is what some Afghans and the Taliban believe. They believe that we need to be, and we intend to have, a significant military presence in Afghanistan for a long time. This is an argument that I also had when I was ambassador there with not many, but a number of very senior Afghans who believed that, who had accepted conspiracy theories that somehow we were manipulating the situation so we could keep our forces in Afghanistan. Every American president from the beginning of our presence there has made clear that we want to find a way to withdraw our forces, but in a way that maintains stability in the region in Afghanistan, which doesn't sacrifice the gains that have been made, including in women's rights and education, and which secures Afghanistan as a place that is not a home for international terror. And that will remain the case, I'm confident. And it's not the presence of the military forces that's gonna secure that vision or not. It is really a broader political issue that needs to be addressed, as we've all said.
All right, let's have a question from that last row.
My name is Esteban Rodriguez. I'm from George Mason University, as well as an intern for the State Department. My question is, in consideration to the withdrawal of the U.S., how will Afghanistan respond to a growing Chinese presence in the region? This question is to anyone who's willing to answer.
Okay. Want to take the question about the China almost?
Yeah, go ahead.
China's role in Afghanistan is mostly a positive factor right now and in the recent past, as China's interest in the region has grown. It's actually something that we Americans have encouraged because there is a significant overlap of interest between China and the rest of the international community in stability in the region. So we have tried to work with the Chinese bilaterally and multilaterally to see how we could develop cooperation with Beijing that would benefit the region. China has its own economic and other interests in the region that it's pursuing, particularly the One Belt, One Road initiative, of which Afghanistan hopes to become a party and a beneficiary as that goes forward. That's also a difficult enterprise for a number of reasons, including the dependency that is being created for some countries on China's investment in infrastructure and other things. That will be a problem for Pakistan. It already is becoming a problem. But I think China can have a positive role there, and many Afghans, I think, understand and appreciate that.
Can I just add to that? I completely agree with what Ambassador Cunningham said. I was just in Beijing in December talking with the Chinese about these kinds of issues. And just to emphasize one point that Ambassador Cunningham made, Afghanistan is not currently part of the Belt and Road Initiative because of insecurity in Afghanistan. That's what the Chinese would say. So if there is a political settlement in Afghanistan and a return to stability, presumably Afghanistan would be in a position to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative and the interconnectivity of inner Asia, which I think most people would regard as a good thing, and it actually aligns very much with Ashraf Ghani's vision of the Asian roundabout. So I think that if peace and stability come to Afghanistan, it can really harness Chinese interest in a very positive way.
Thank you. Yeah, you please.
Hi, my name is Kevin Killian. I'm a private citizen. I wanted to ask about the international funding of terrorists by Saudi Arabia, is particularly Afghanistan. So they and also Yemen and economic war against Doha. So how is that that Afghanistan gets all the heat and Saudi Arabia doesn't get any?
So the question was about the Saudi Arabia and its funding the terrorism. So the question was not very clear to me. If you have answered the question.
So the United States is helping recruit terrorists with their military presence. It's the main and the Saudis are funding them in Syria and Libya and other places.
I think it's beyond our range here to get into a whole discussion about Saudi Arabia. I'd just simply say that the focus in Afghanistan is because that's where the attack was planned and launched from, and where the center of the people who were responsible for that existed.
Okay. Yes, can we have Rebecca from here, please?
Can I just add a point on that last point? There's actually, there's a significant issue here, which is the United States does not historically have a quarrel with the Taliban, okay? We have been fighting, in some sense, against the Taliban for the last 18 years, but it was because of the safe haven that had been established in Afghanistan. It was the presence of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan that led to the intervention in 2001. And in some fundamental sense, we have never actually been in conflict with the Taliban per se. And so that is another one of the reasons why there is an overlap in the Venn diagram, as Ambassador Jalali said, because our quarrel is not with the Taliban, it's with al-Qaeda and now Daesh and other groups.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Mansour, and I was working with USAID Afghanistan at the Office of Democracy and Governance. My question is to Ambassador Kanhangam. And speaking of regional politics, we do have these relationship. I mean, Iran has been a strategic partner to Russia for a long period of time. And then similarly, Pakistan has been a strategic partner with the UK. Considering the Afghans' potential and the US interest in the region, do you believe that Afghanistan would be a strategic partner for the US going forward? Thank you.
It already is a strategic partner with the U.S. We have one of the things that I negotiated when I was in Afghanistan was the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which sets out the framework for it sets out the political framework for our cooperation bilaterally and in the region on a whole range of issues. And as part of that partnership, I think we can look forward to a long period of regional cooperation with Afghanistan in the region, which I think most Afghans very much want to see happen. And again, with the United States and the international community as partners of Afghanistan, and using that partnership to improve stability in the region as well as in Afghanistan itself.
All right, we will have a last question. I'm sorry that we are running out of time. Yes, you please.
Thank you. Sean Carberry. I was a journalist in Afghanistan at the same time Ambassador Cunningham was there. Currently with the Pentagon Inspector General's office, and we do reporting on Afghanistan. Last summer, Borhan Osman wrote a paper for USIP looking at the Taliban perspective on negotiated settlement. And I think maybe, Ambassador Olson, this might be for you to look at what are some of the internal red lines and challenges for the Taliban in terms of what the leadership can agree to that they can bring the base along with without getting into splintering, factioning, and what some of the challenges are going to be for them to accept terms internally.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's an excellent question, and it's hard to answer. One of the many reasons that one should start a formal negotiation process is because we don't know exactly what the Taliban demands are, as opposed to what their publicly stated positions are. And it's clear that their publicly stated position is the withdrawal of foreign forces. But there may be other demands, and these need to be revealed. What I would suggest again is that I don't think we can look at the Taliban as being 10 feet tall in this regard. I mean, one of the most interesting things that happened in the last year was the first Eid ceasefire, in which the Taliban foot soldiers came in from the countryside and came into the towns. And it was clear they were delighted to be out of the countryside and in the towns and going to the doctor and getting ice cream or whatever it was they were doing. And it betrayed, I think, a fundamental weakness on the part of the Taliban. The Taliban's foot soldiers are probably ready for peace, just like most Afghans are ready for peace. And so I think once a dynamic of peace is established and negotiations begin, I think all sides are going to lose the incentivization for continuing the fight. I mean, I think they're going to lose their foot soldiers. And so that's why I think you need to kind of front-end load the peace process. You need to get the major issues out of the way, and then create a negotiating dynamic.
Thank you very much. We're sorry that we cannot take more questions. We are out of time. Thank you very much for being here. I hope to see Afghanistan peaceful very soon and to have ski and hiking in those beautiful mountains. Please join me in welcoming you.